So I've lived in Colorado my entire life, over 40 years, and every single year, I have people tell me about how they regret coming to Colorado, or more importantly, their expectations just didn't meet what reality is out here. So in this video today, I'm actually going to share with you guys some of the most common examples of this and hopefully make it a little bit easier decision for you if that is on your radar for considering coming out here to Colorado and living in Denver, the Mile High City. Really excited to share this episode with you of living in Denver. Let's go. All right, guys, so as I said, today's gonna be all about some of these regrets that people have that do decide to move out to Denver, Colorado. Before we get started, all that info on the screen down below, feel free to reach out. My name is Adam Lang, I'm a licensed realtor, and I've lived here for over 42 years and don't plan on going anywhere. So I love talking all about Denver, and hopefully if you have some questions, I'd love to help answer them. But let's go ahead and get started again about the first regret that I hear so often, and that has to do just with social life. A lot of people don't realize when they move to Denver that social life's a little bit different out here. You know, there are some stereotypes when you think about Coloradans, driving in their Subarus and, maybe wearing a hemp necklace, maybe smelling like patchouli, just kind of making some jokes about hippies. Basically, we are very, in tune with the mountains and definitely live very healthy, active lifestyles out here. That's definitely one of the main reasons I stay out here, and a lot of other people move out here for that same reason. But the social life that kind of goes along with that is a little bit different than some of the bigger cities. If you're coming from a big city like Chicago or New York, where you've got restaurants and bars open until 2 in the morning, 7 days a week, well, you're gonna be stretched thin out in Denver to find that in that same style of social life that you might have in other places back home. Now, when it comes to social life, as I said, definitely a lot more healthy, active lifestyle people. In fact, we recently were ranked 5th in the entire nation for the fittest people in the country. The American College of Sports Medicine also frequently rates Denver as one of the least obese cities in America. So with hearing stats like that, you can imagine, people really do prioritize their healthy, active lifestyles, and social life kind of coincides with that. So, maybe instead of going out on a Friday night until 2 in the morning, there are still options for that, but instead it might be a little bit more common to find intramural sports at 5 o'clock after work on a Friday evening. Or maybe it's also just getting groups together and going up to the mountains for a fun weekend, skiing or going mountain biking. Tons of great social life out here. It's just sometimes a little bit different than what people expect. And for some, they don't realize that until it's too late. Now, once somebody does settle into Denver socially, the next big regret for a lot of people does actually have to do with the house, with the real estate. So that's what I want to talk about next. So the second regret that most people have actually has to do more with choosing the wrong suburb. Now, Denver, when you look at it on a map, it just looks like any normal city. But what I love about Denver is how we really do have all of these micro communities within our larger community of Denver. Colorado actually just recently, in the end of last year, broke 6 million full-time residents here. So we are growing fast. Now, if you start looking at Denver on a map, you're going to notice that the biggest city within Denver is actually Aurora. And Aurora has over 300,000 residents. And the reason I want to use this as an example when it comes to these micro communities and just how important it is to not just have Denver be your ideal place you want to live, but really dialing in exactly where in Denver best fits your lifestyle. Within Aurora, I'm just going to use school systems and the ratings as an example. Now, anytime I talk about schools, I always recommend checking it out for yourself. I love a website, it's called niche.com. I'll put a link down below, but just to use this as an example within Aurora. Now, if you're looking at Aurora on a map, you can see it's obviously massive, but there's some areas that have much higher school ratings than others. For example, we have Cherry Creek School District within Aurora, and that frequently has one of the top rated school districts in the entire state. And in fact, it's always, usually within the top 3, along with Boulder being one of the others. But again, back to Aurora and Cherry Creek. Cherry Creek is always at one of the highest ratings in the entire state. In fact, they recently posted that it was 52% reading proficiency and 41% for the math proficiency. Now, if you go into just a little bit different area within Aurora, in a different school district, you're going to be amazed at how different these numbers could be. It could go from being one of the top to being kind of almost near the bottom. For example, Aurora Public Schools, they're only at about 24% for the reading proficiency, and math proficiency is only 14%. So hopefully that area can start to see some improvement soon, but just wanted to use that as one example of how these micro communities can really differ from one area to the next. So if you're considering moving out here and you just see, an area within Aurora that looks great and you think, it's going to be a good spot for your family, well, man, you get there, you move in, and all of a sudden you find out that the schools are so bad that you end up completely leaving the state a couple years later. So to avoid making those types of mistakes or regrets, I think it's just so important to understand that there are these micro communities all throughout Denver, and it really takes just getting in touch with somebody local that can help kind of guide you a little bit on this. Just one little quick plug on my website. If you go to adamstillsdenver.com, I've got this really nice interactive map of over 20 of the main areas within Denver. Of each of these, you can click on them. That's interactive. You can learn a little bit more about the types of homes, the restaurants, school ratings, all that kind of stuff. So that's at least maybe one step you could take if you're kind of curious about what some of these micro neighborhoods are and maybe which ones best fit the style of life that you want to have here in Denver. Now, one last thing before we move on, and this is a little bit more real estate specific, but you can really apply this to any area within Denver. I always like to use the pick 2 out of 3 principle. So if you think of 3 things, which are price of the home, location of the home, and condition of the home. Condition meaning, is it brand new with everything perfect, or maybe it's a little bit older of a home that needs some updates. That's what condition means. Almost always when people are considering moving out here, I do a pretty good job of at least being able to guide them in places that they're gonna find 2 out of those 3 characteristics. So if price point is really important to you, and you really want to be, for example, in a good school district, a specific location, well, depending on where that might be, the condition, that third element, you might need to sacrifice that one a little bit. So that's just one example of how, we can really start to gain a little bit more knowledge from a conversation, and then I can start, kind of giving you some direction and some ideas for where you might want to look a little bit further into to see if that's the right spot for you. I also just want to share, when it comes to location, the distance for commuting can drastically differ depending on where you're located. So even if you're looking at a map and you find 2 different areas that are both within, let's just say, 2 miles of downtown Denver, well, if you live on the western side of downtown Denver, that might be a quick, 5 to 7 minute drive. If you live on the east or maybe to the south of downtown Denver, that could be a 30-minute drive depending on what roads you're taking to get into town. So it's a lot more than just looking at it on a map, and it does take a little bit more insider local knowledge to really make sure you don't have those regrets that I frequently see other people unfortunately having. Now, believe it or not, even if you do find that right suburb, that right micro community that really best fits what you're looking for, there's still one other everyday reality that so many people unfortunately overestimate. And believe it or not, you guys, even if you do find that right suburb or that right micro community, there's still one other everyday reality that so many people unfortunately underestimate, and that's going to be traffic. So traffic is something that I know every city deals with, but Denver specifically, we are really experiencing this a lot right now, and it's something that I've really noticed just as a Colorado and Denver native ever since I started driving about 25 years ago, just how different some of the rush hour times throughout the day, just the amount of time that it takes to get from point A to point B, even in areas that are a little bit more rural. It just is completely different than it used to be. And man, just kind of piggybacking off of that last point, this is such an important thing to really have a clear understanding of before ever deciding to buy a house or even just to move and rent a place for a year. Just making sure that you have that traffic really understood to a point where you're not going to get stuck in an area that you're always dealing with just traffic jams and congestion. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, we actually just surpassed 6 million for our population here in Colorado, and that is pretty crazy when you consider how fast we've expanded into a lot larger area within Denver. In 1990, we were only at about 3.3 million. So really in the last 30 years, 35 years, we've doubled almost in our size. So pretty crazy to think about. Obviously more people, that means more cars, and more cars on the road. That's inevitably, we're gonna have congestion. But I think, again, what I really want to hit home here is how there are parts of Denver that are much more set up and established to handle this additional volume than others. And man, that can really be a sore spot for people that don't realize this when they relocate or move out here until it's too late. Now, the only other side note that I want to share with you guys on this one, since I'm a huge skier, I love the mountains, I love getting up there as much as I can, and I'm guessing you guys might be the same if you're considering moving out here to Colorado. There is so much to really understand when it comes to accessibility. When you live on the western side of town, and that's actually where I live in Littleton, which is southwestern part of Denver, but I grew up in Wheat Ridge, which is really just due west of downtown Denver. Anytime you live on that side of town, you're so much more close and more conveniently located when it comes to accessing the foothills on a more nightly or weekly basis. What I mean by that is so many people move out here and they have these expectations where I'm gonna move to Denver, every day after work, I'm gonna get off work, I'm gonna jump on my mountain bike, and I'm just gonna explore these incredible trails that are, always, just a few minutes away. At least that's what they think. Well, if you live on the western side of town, yeah, that's super achievable and not a big deal at all. Well, if you end up moving maybe somewhere to the south or southeast, maybe like southeast Aurora, and you really want to get still to those foothills in the mountains, what might be only a 5 or 10 minute drive for people in Wheat Ridge in the western side of town, it might be 45 minutes, maybe even a little bit longer depending on traffic, times of day, that kind of stuff, to do the same thing after work. So, people that have those expectations, reality sits in, and after fighting traffic a couple days after work, they give up on that altogether and kind of get a little discouraged, because that was the whole reason maybe that they moved out here, to have that daily active lifestyle. So just really making that point clear that with traffic and how congested certain parts of town are, man, if this is really high on your importance list of just getting out and enjoying the mountains on a more regular basis, you really want to make sure you're intentionally picking areas that don't have these bottlenecks when it comes to traffic. And then one more point to make, once people move out here and they kind of adjust to the traffic and those expectations, then it comes down to the cost of living and just their finances. And this is a whole other thing. I've done a lot of other videos completely on this topic, but really all I wanted to get across on this one is how Denver is really changing right now when it comes to affordability, just the cost of living, all of those types of talking points. As a realtor, I frequently get a lot of different news articles sent to me, and there's actually one that just came out this past week where Denver, or I should say Colorado, was ranked as the 5th most expensive state when it comes to average or median home prices. So Colorado was number 5 on the list. Maybe you can guess what some of the others were. Number 1 was Hawaii. Now, taking that a little step further, looking at the median home prices that were sold recently in Denver, right at about $550,000 versus the areas a little bit further out were about $530,000. But just making the point, over $500,000 are the median sales price homes in the Denver area. That's a little bit more than a lot of people are realizing that exists out here. And I think that's not just that people really need to understand. Home insurance is extremely expensive out here. We're seeing this across the country right now with how different a lot of the climate issues have been, just changing over the past few decades. But in Colorado and Denver specifically, we've started to see a lot of the big insurance companies even completely leaving the state. Things like fire insurance, flood damage. There's just certain types of insurance that some companies just either aren't even insuring people for anymore, or it's just becoming so expensive that it just doesn't make sense financially for people with their numbers. So that's just another example of one other expensive aspects to Colorado. But another one is also property taxes. So this is something that I really wanted just to hit on for a second, because I get this question all the time. So in Colorado, our property taxes are a little different than maybe some other states. And if you're here in Denver, the average is usually right around 0.5%. So if you buy a $500,000 home, you're looking at paying, roughly about 0.5% annually for your property tax. So a $500,000 house, that would be $2,500 a year in that property tax. Now, I need to make this point very clear. That's not everywhere. There's certain areas in Denver that are much, much higher than that. In fact, one area close to kind of where I live now in the southwestern side of Denver, it's called Sterling Ranch, and it's a beautiful area. It's actually really close to Roxborough, which has these really fun red rock formations, great hikes, great mountain biking, lots of wildlife. But this isn't an area that is a master plan community. It's very new. They've only been building Sterling Ranch for about 15 years or so. So when you find these newer build communities, oftentimes you're going to have a higher property tax rate to help subsidize all of this growth and construction and civil engineering, all this stuff that's being built because of this new development, as well as sometimes you'll also find what they call a metro tax district. So I like to use Sterling Ranch as an example just because it's fairly close to me, but more importantly, how much of a difference it can be. In Sterling Ranch, it's actually almost 1.5% instead of that 0.5% average that I shared with you a minute ago. So let's just say that $500,000 house example, instead of maybe $2,500 a year in certain parts of Denver for the annual property tax bill, you're looking at almost 3 times that. Maybe it's $7,000 a year for that same $500,000 house that's just located in a different area. So this is just another thing that people oftentimes get caught off guard about, and oftentimes have some regrets if they ended up living in one of these types of areas. So kind of a rule of thumb is if you find a newer community, anything that's a master plan community or just an area that has mostly newer built homes, there's a good chance you might find a higher property tax amount there, or you also might find some of these metro tax districts. Something definitely to keep in mind. Now, before we close out this video, I just wanted to throw in one bonus tip here, and this is something that, you know, it's hard to put to paper. It's hard to have actual like metrics to measure this, but one thing that I do oftentimes hear from people that are, you know, considering coming out to Colorado is that they thought it was more of a mountain town vibe. Even though it's in Denver, they still had this feel that we really were kind of like a mountain town, even though we're here in Denver. And, you know, there are areas that you can kind of still get this feel. A couple examples would be downtown Golden, or maybe going up further northwest to areas like Boulder. So you can still find areas that do feel a little bit more like you're kind of in the mountains. But I think this is something that so commonly is a big surprise to people, is it's still a big city. Denver is not this mountain town. In fact, you know, we do sit at a mile high. That's why you frequently hear me say the mile high city. So we sit at 5,280 feet, but we really are located on the plains. And I love in Colorado, one of the nicest things about Denver is if you have difficulty with directions, anytime you need to know what direction west is, if you're in Denver, you just look to the mountains and you know that direction is west. Well, kind of the same idea here. Everything to the east of Denver is flat plain land. A lot of times people kind of get that confused, which is kind of hard for me to believe. Now, I also want to give a caveat that one huge perk or benefit of being in a little bit more flat, a little bit more arid type environment in Denver as opposed to the mountains is that our winters are not nearly as bad as a lot of people think. This is actually probably one of the biggest exciting kind of realizations that people have when they do move here. So instead of a regret, something that a lot of people are actually very pleasantly surprised about is just how mild the Denver winters are. And I wanted to bring this one up because right now, today as I'm filming this, it's March 12th, 2026, and it's actually supposed to hit 80 degrees in a couple days here in Denver. I think it's like 25 degrees over the average this time of year, but this entire winter, in fact, it's been the driest winter on record this year. And this winter, we've actually had the highest number of days over 60 degrees, I think, on record as well. So, you know, very, very mellow, easy to deal with winters, very pleasantly surprise customers and just people that move here oftentimes. That's one of the things I hear the most, as well as, you know, this claim to fame of we always talk about how we have 300 days of sunshine a year in Colorado, and that's definitely true. In fact, it's more than a lot of the other states that are even on the ocean and in areas that you think would have more sunshine than here. But this is just another reason why it's so easy to get through the colder winter months because of that sunshine. And Colorado, it's one of these states where if you don't like the weather, wait 15 minutes. You know, you could have a day where it's cold and blustery and gross out, and the next day it could be 70 degrees and sunny. So it's kind of like what we're dealing with right now. So just really wanted to make that point clear. So yes, we are surrounded close to the mountains, but we're not in the mountains here in Denver. So we're not really a mountain town like some people think, although it's very, very easily accessible. Some of my favorite ski areas are within 2 to 2.5 hour drive from here. Some of the best hikes in the entire state are even closer than that. There's so much accessibility, even if it is an hour or two away, with how well maintained the I-70 corridor is to get up to those different areas in the mountains. It's still very achievable. So I just wanted to kind of end it with that. Even though we're not in the mountains, you can still access the mountains very easily, and you can still live that healthy, active mountain lifestyle if you want, and still live in the Denver metro area. So before we close out this video, I just want to zoom out for a second and just really understand that people don't regret moving to Denver because Denver is bad or, you know, a terrible place to live. Most likely they actually regret moving to Denver just because they didn't understand some of these trade-offs. And those trade-offs are very important to know up front. And that's why it's so important just to come out here and just experience it for yourself and try to do that in a few different times or climates. Meaning maybe if you've already been out here in the summertime, come out here during a winter month. Or maybe you've been out here only in the warmer times of years. Maybe come out in like December or January and just see really what it's like to live in Denver, even in the winter. I think this is the best way to really get a good grasp of this. And it's very easy to do because all 4 seasons, all really 12 months of the year in Colorado, there's always some fun, cool things to do, and definitely worth making a trip out here to enjoy. So if you guys want tips on certain things to do, depending on what time of year you're considering coming out here, feel free to reach out. I'll put all that info down below one last time. And I just want to close it out with this, you guys. If you are seriously considering Denver and you just want to get a little bit more knowledge on what it's like right now to succeed and win when it comes to buying a home in the Denver metro area, a lot of stuff going on in the news right now with affordability, just challenges with interest rates, challenges with just, whether or not it's a good or a bad time to buy a home. We go through all of this on these live monthly Denver Homebuyer webinars that I put together. They're free, they're online, they do fill up, so make sure you guys grab a seat to the next one. If this does sound interesting, I'll put a link down below, denverwebinar.com. I hope to see you guys on that next one. And more than anything else, I just want to thank you guys for another great episode of Living in Denver. If you have any questions, reach out, and I look forward to sharing a brand new episode with you guys next week on Living in Denver. I'm Adam. I'll see you guys later. Bye.